Hi, my name's Craig and I'm here today to talk to you about connecting to an ECU using the boot method and a test probe with the AUTOTUNER tool. When connecting via boot mode, we're going to have to open an ECU safely. I'm now going to hand over to Simon, who's going to show you how.
Hi everybody, I'm Simon from Viezu Technologies, and in today's video we're going to take you through the basic steps of how to open an ECU and how to reseal one safely and securely to put back into the vehicle. So there's a few bits of equipment we're going to need generally for most ECUs. It will vary from ECU manufacturer to ECU manufacturer. Sometimes a pair of pliers may be useful to help sort of bend one of the tabs around to reseal a ECU, such as a SID 208 ECU, quite often found on the Siemens ECUs, things like PCR 2.1s. Instead of screwed down lids, as we can see here with the screws in the back of the lid, on the PCRs, you'll have what's described as little tabs. They sort of bend round and clamp into place. But for today's, we're going through Bosch ECUs. We've got one that's already opened here, it's our training one. A little bit grubby, as you can see, it's been used several times. When dealers come in, they practice on this ECU before they take any sort of bench tuning or boot tuning equipment away with them. And we've got another ECU here, ready to use for our demonstration, how we open the ECU and the methods that we use when we're working on ECU. So first and foremost, we'll go through a bit of the equipment we're going to need. We've got a couple of flathead screwdrivers. You can use a variety of different sort of lever bars or pry bars on there. Flathead screwdrivers tend to be the best. You want ones that you can easily control. You don't want one that's sort of like 2 foot long, like a big crowbar, because you're not going to have control over it. So when you're trying to lever the lid up, you've got a risk of slipping, damaging the ECU circuit board inside. So something that's got a nice sort of thin edge to it, but a nice wide sort of point to even the pressure as you're lifting up. So a couple of flathead screwdrivers. We're going to need something like a standing knife or box cutting tools, anything with a nice sharp edge on there. This one's quite nice and safe because we can just slide it out a small amount. We need this to help break the silicon seal that's going to be just inside the edge of the ECU. If we can break that with the blade, it means it's got less resistance as we're trying to lift the ECU lid up. It's going to take less effort and also, again, less risk of damage to the ECU. We're not having to put loads of pressure on those sort of lever bars. We've also got ourselves a little electric screwdriver here, just to help us take the ECU screws out a little bit quicker. You can use a normal sort of screwdriver on there. They are Torx bits, typically in ECUs, but some may be Posi or sort of Phillips heads on there. Whatever you need, obviously find the right screwdriver head, if you like, for the screw that's in there, and just take the screws out. Remember, obviously, to keep them somewhere safe, don't lose them, because you will need them when we're putting the ECU lid back on. We've also got some general sort of multi-purpose clutch and brake cleaner. This helps break the seal again on the silicone that's holding that lid in place. Now, not all lids will have that silicone seal, but it does help break that seal if it is there, and helps just separate the lid from the circuit board if it's bonded on in any sort of position. The beautiful thing about this is you can sort of soak the ECU in that clutch or brake cleaner. Make sure you let it dry for a period of time, of course. We don't want to be connecting to anything while it's wet, but because of the nature of this, it does evaporate off. So if you leave it for a period of time, it will evaporate off. It doesn't leave any nasty residues on there. It doesn't leave anything conductive after either. So it's a really handy thing. We do recommend strongly that you do not, to be clear, do not use heat when trying to open the ECU. Whilst it can be beneficial, heat the silicone up around the outside. It makes it more pliable, easier to sort of peel the lid and stretch the lid up, especially to get the blade underneath and create that separation. The risk of using heat is very dangerous. To get it hot enough to sort of soften that silicone seal up, you run the risk of the heat bypassing the ECU lid, getting onto the circuit board, and you could have the tiniest little sort of 1 or 2 millimeter wide resistors and little connections on the board just moving slightly. The solder gets warm, the heat blowing through from your heat gun can literally blow the resistor off. You may never see that resistor again, and you've got no idea why the car won't start, or it's because the resistor disappeared out the side of the ECU and it's on your workshop floor somewhere. Good luck trying to find it. Don't use heat on an ECU if you can help it, trying to open the lid. We've also got what looks the most like general sort of multi-purpose silicone on there. This is actually, it's called black gasket, making silicone on there. You want something that is obviously water resistant, hence the silicone, but something that's temperature resistant as well. So because of the nature of this, it's not going to be conductive on the ECU board, and it also withstands, I think in this case, this particular one, up to 260 degrees. If we're getting much above 260 degrees on the ECU, we've got bigger problems than whether the silicone's going to go a bit soft and pliable. We're kind of trying to work out why someone's put the ECU in an oven on gas mark 5 what's happening in the engine bay, what's causing that ECU to get so hot when it's sat in its own little box somewhere, nice and protected on some of the BMWs, for example, under the scuttle panel, underneath the windscreen. We shouldn't really be having 250 plus degrees of temperature in those general areas. Right, so let's get into it then. We're going to go through the process. We're going to start opening the ECU, starting with our little electric screwdriver first and foremost. And we're just going to connect into our little Torx screws and take them all out. That's our 4 screws out, and now we're left with the ECU lid still in place. The screws are out, the securing pins are out, so now we need to basically soak the outside of that ECU lid around the edge with our brake and clutch cleaner. Obviously don't do it on a big angle like this, because as soon as you spray it's all going to run off. So you want to keep it on a nice flat surface, something you don't mind getting any overspray on. I'm just going to hold it about a 45-degree angle, a few inches away, and spray around. If you've got a nice little applicator straw, as this particular one has, a bit like sort of WD-40 or most sort of lubricating sprays have, we can put that into there, and we've got a nice controlled spray. Just go all the way around the outside. You want to leave it on there for a good sort of minute or two, maybe reapply it a couple of times so you know it's thoroughly sort of soaked in. And once you've completed that, we then move on to using our screwdrivers. Now when we're connecting with our screwdrivers to the ECU, you'll notice on some ECUs we have this indented edge. This is where our heat sinks are on the ECU. This is the hardest part of the ECU to actually open, to separate. This is going to be like the final bit we're going to work our way towards. What we recommend is you start on the opposite side somewhere, either in one of the bottom corners or top corners. Usually this bottom corner is the best because you're not right next to the connector block. You're going to get your screwdriver under the edge of the ECU lid, and you're going to start to work your way around, almost sort of walking the screwdrivers along the edge. A little bit of pressure. Move one along, lift it up, other one along to take the pressure, and sort of work your way around the ECU lid. As you go along, periodically you're going to stop every sort of inch or two. You got our standing knife in there, and we're just going to put in just underneath to the edge, and you can see this raised edge of the ECU there. That's as far as we want to go. No more about sort of 5 or 6 mil. You'll feel the edge of the silicone there, and we're just going to gently apply a bit of pressure as we slide along, trying to break that silicone seal. You'll hear it, it's almost like something sizzling in a frying pan, that sort of like sound as you're going along. Can't quite do the impression of it, but you'll know the sound when you see it and hear it. You can hear the silicone starting to separate on there. As we work our way around, we're gently lifting the ECU lid up. We want to encroach on the ECU, no more about this sort of black edge that you can see on the screwdriver here. So again, it's a few millimeters. So that black edge perfectly takes us into where that raised lip is on the ECU lid. That's where our silicone seal is. That's where we're trying to get into. It is important we do not insert the screwdriver like this. This is going to be very bad for the ECU. Risk of taking things off the ECU circuit board, damaging microprocessors, and basically having a big expensive repair bill at the end of it. So you only need to encroach a few millimeters, about half a centimetre or so, into the ECU in most cases to separate the ECU lid. It's also important that we get the correct angle. So I'm just going to move this into the centre of the screen now so you can see. We do not want to be putting our screwdrivers in and then lifting in this direction. What that's going to do, if you see the screwdriver here, that's going to be putting all of the pressure on the edge of the ECU. We're actually going to be levering against the ECU circuit board. So if you look at our ECU over here that's already open, if I apply that method, I'm actually pushing on the circuit board, trying to lift the ECU lid up. Again, if something goes wrong, I run the risk of sliding across the ECU. We really don't want that to happen. So when we're in there, that few millimeters, what we're looking to do is lift away, so up and away. So we're pushing against the edge of the ECU itself, not lifting up and onto the circuit board. So we want the pressure away. And we're going to work our screwdrivers around, as I said, every sort of few inches or so. Then we get in our nice sort of blade on here, our standing knife. The beautiful thing with this is it's adjustable. We can set it to a nice safe amount so that even if we did slip, I can't go any further than the earth strip that runs around the outside. So even if I go slightly further than the silicone seal, I'm not going to suddenly start taking resistors and capacitors off the board. Now, it will vary from ECU to ECU as to how far you want to encroach under the lid, but this is where it's important to use the instructions and information from the tuning tool that you're using to have a look at the circuit board layout first. So you might see any sort of dangerous spots where there's a few chips quite close to that one corner. Maybe we sort of don't encroach as much in that edge of the ECU. So always check the instruction manual on the tuning tool you're using before you open the ECU. Obviously you want to make sure it's supported as well first before you open the ECU and then realise, oh, it's not even supported on the tool. So always double check the instruction manuals first on any tools you're using before you start opening the ECU. So you'll see on this ECU now, we'll try and get our screwdrivers into this sort of edge here and we'll begin to lift away from the ECU. So we'll get 2 in there, and so we'll lift. Sometimes putting a little bit of a twist on the screwdriver to lift it up as we're moving along. You may have to find yourself sort of really digging in and then lifting up to get it to lift up. And once we've moved a small amount along, we'll simply leave 1 screwdriver in there, get our standing knife, and we'll encroach into here and we'll try and just break that silicon seal as we go around. We've worked our way all the way down to this edge here. I'm just going to take the screwdriver back out. We've worked our way down to almost down to about this edge here. We want to make sure that we're sort of a little bit down here, a little bit at the side, working both edges at the same time. So we're trying to get an even lift. This edge is going to be the hardest one to do. Again, starting from the back of the ECU, away from the loom connector, working your way around. Eventually, once you've got enough of the ECU lid lifted up, you'll find right size screwdriver to get in there. You'll find as you start to lift the ECU lid up, once you've worked your way around with the screwdrivers, it should start to lift away almost towards this corner here. You might find the loom connector edge comes away first, that's fine, and your ECU lid starts to come up like this. If you need to, don't be scared, apply some more spray. Apply some more brake and clutch cleaner just to soften up the silicon, make it easier, and eventually you'll get to a point, probably about this angle, where you start to feel quite a bit of tension. And that's because this is starting to bend at this point. You don't want that to bend too much. So if it's got to that point here and you're starting to, almost feels like you're bending the lid, just stop. Put the ECU lid back down and work the screwdrivers again back along this edge so it lifts up nicely and evenly, and then eventually our ECU lid comes off. I just want to show you inside here. We can see on the back of the lid this black bead of silicon from the factory. That's the seal. That's that raised edge on this side, easy to see there, on this side that we're trying to get our screwdrivers in and separate away from the ECU circuit board. So you see on this ECU example, that black silicon edge along here, you can see where the heat sinks were that we're trying to separate away from. You can put more thermal paste on there when you're resealing the ECU. It's one of those things, it's tuner's preference if you want to do that. I do recommend if you're doing that, you probably want to clear all the excess that was there to begin with off. In all the years we've been doing this, we've never had to reapply any sort of heatsink material on there. As long as we're not sort of getting lots of dirt and grime on there, when we reseal the lid of the ECU, it's absolutely fine. There's enough still connection and thermal sort of transfer through there that it doesn't overheat anything in the ECU. I say it's been a good sort of 20 plus years we've probably been doing this now, sitting in these ECUs. They're absolutely fine. So to reconnect the ECU lid, to basically reverse the steps, we've finished doing all the tuning on there. We now need to put our silicon back onto the ECU to create that nice seal. So we've got something here, it's a nice sort of trigger controlled. You can use anything, you can use sort of almost like a plumber's applicator to sort of squeeze the silicon on around the outside. A lot of people will come to the circuit board and start laying it down here. They'll start putting the silicon all the way around there. The problem is you've got a raised edge and you're trying to apply the silicon on top of that raised edge. Well, it wants to almost sort of run off from one side to the other. You end up, as you're trying to apply the silicon here, with a very sort of wobbly line as you're going along. Well, the easiest way is to utilise the lid. It has a groove built in where the silicon was before. Remember, we're trying to apply the tiniest little bead just to get a waterproof silicon seal on there. So we're just going to gently squeeze our applicator and run a bead of silicon through the groove. We'll repeat that process all the way around. Don't worry if you get slightly too much on there. We don't want to be going crazy like some sort of a silly string can and spraying it all over the ECU circuit board. Whilst yes, it will give a very good waterproof seal, it's going to be a nightmare. If you ever need to open that ECU and the customer chooses to go to stage 2 or stage 3, and you need to connect to the ECU again, you're going to have instant regret because you're not going to be able to get that ECU lid off because the entire thing has become one big giant glued piece onto there. You run the risk of separating chips from the circuit board as they've stuck to the silicon instead of the solder. The silicon ends up being a stronger bond almost than the solder that's holding that little resistor on. So try and keep it nice and neat around the edge. Make no mistakes, a little blue roll or something, clutch clean if you need to, clean the lid up, work on the lid, because if you do make a mistake on this, it's easy to clean it up. If you get silicone all over the circuit board, it's much harder to clean it up if you make a mistake. Once you've got the silicone all the way around the edge, we then simply place the lid back down and put the screws back in. Now we've finished putting the silicone around that groove in the ECU lid, we simply need to reseat it onto the ECU. So we'll take our lid, position it the correct way round. I'm going to start on that left-hand side as I'm looking at it, so the right-hand side to you, where our heatsink is, effectively reversing the steps that we did when we took the lid off. We're going to line it back up so we can see the holes for the screws through the hole in the lid. I'm just going to push it down and get a nice, clean seal. Okay, just want to remove any air bubbles, making sure that silicone bead is all the way around nicely. Now we simply need to put the screws back in. So when I do the screws, I tend to put them in the opposite way. Okay, so what I do is opposite corners, a bit like when you put a wheel on a car, you go top, bottom, left and right to get even load. I'll do the same on here. So I'll start in the corner that's closest to myself. I'll then go to the opposite corner, so I don't put too much tension on the one side of the lid, causing it to peel up too much on the other side. Let's go opposite corners, get our screw into there. And it doesn't really matter which one you do next. I'm just going to come down to this one down here. Holding the ECU securely as well. It's a little handheld electric screwdriver. There's a little bit of torque in there, so. And there we go. That's our ECU sealed back up, ready to be put back into the car. So I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. It's really important that we follow those basic steps, making sure we don't put our screwdrivers too far into the ECU, or whatever lever bar you're using or method you're using, don't insert that pry bar too far into the ECU. Don't go any further than the groove on that lid, that little raised edge shows you really where the silicone seal is. Beyond that point, you could risk damaging the ECU. We use our clutch or brake cleaner to help sort of soften the silicone and give us an easier sort of release of the ECU lid. Using our Stanley knife or blade, preferably an adjustable one so we can measure how much is really going into the ECU. We don't want a big sort of giant sort of carving knife trying to cut away at the silicone. Apart from the fact it's dangerous to use something like that when trying to open an ECU. The risk is you go too far in and you can do damage to the circuit board. Use an electric screwdriver as well to help take the screws out a bit quicker, and making sure we're using some sort of automotive silicone seal that's got some temperature resistance in there as well, isn't conductive, so it can give us a nice waterproof seal on the ECU lid without any risk of damage to the ECU.
Now that you've seen how to open an ECU safely, let's talk about the equipment that you'll need to do the job correctly. You'll need the mains, the test probe itself, the stand for the test probe, the wire connecting the test probe, the universal box, the universal cable, and of course the AUTOTUNER tool itself. Now we know what equipment we'll need to connect to the ECU. For today's demonstration, we'll be using an EDC17C10, which is for Peugeot 208 1.4 litre HDI. We now need to jump over to the application and see how to connect. We'll need to connect the AUTOTUNER tool to the laptop to open the application. Once loaded, it will give you the following options: ECU operations and master operations, which contains functions such as decoding and encrypting. Today, we'll be selecting the ECU operations option. As with the previous videos, we will again be selecting the car icon option, as we know the ECU is from a Peugeot 2008. You have the ability to scroll down this manufacturer menu to find the relevant make, model and ECU for the car. Or you can type in the search bar at the top the exact ECU if you know it. This one being the EDC17C10. You can go a step further by typing Peugeot, thus eliminating other vehicle brands. The results will then be displayed. Double check you have the right one and click on it. This will take you through the operations menu, where you can select bench, boot and OBD. There are other options available for diagnostics and data logging. please see our other AUTOTUNER videos on these topics. Now with these types of specific connections required for this ECU, we're going to need to connect to the bench first. Then come back to this menu later to view the boot option to find out where the boot probe will need to be placed on the ECU's board. Choosing the bench mode option, first select the instructions so we can find out how to safely connect to the ECU. The reason we need to connect via bench first is so that the ECU can still draw power whilst reading and writing the files. This menu gives you an image of the ECU, which helps for identification. If you scroll down the page, it will list all the relevant accessories you will require to connect to the ECU. We will need the universal cable and the mains adapter for this step of the job. Further down the page, it gives you step-by-step instructions on how to connect to the ECU. It's color-coded in line with the universal cable. As we have opened our ECU, we need the board to be facing up so we can flip the instructions on screen, so we can properly connect to the ECU in boot mode. Also, if you're having difficulty seeing the color-coded connections which need to be made to the ECU on screen, there is a dark mode option. This makes things a lot easier. Now let's follow the instructions and connect to the ECU. Now that we're connected via bench, we now need to connect using the boot mode option. To do so, we need to go to the boot instructions. Scrolling down the page again, it shows the required equipment to connect via this method. So let's prepare the equipment so it's ready for connection via boot mode. When looking at the screen and scrolling down to the required accessories, you can see that it needs a probe and a positioning kit. However, that will be covered in another video. Today, we'll be using the probe and the universal box. So let's make our boot connection. Connect the probe to the universal box, then the box to the purple and white wire on the universal cable, which is connected to the tool. Now the probe is assembled, it is time to place the probe onto the board following the instructions on your screen. Please be extra careful when connecting the probe to the ECU, as you could possibly damage the ECU if placed incorrectly. Follow the instructions on the screen using the magnifying glass to make sure the probe is in the correct place. Now the boot connection has been made, it's now time to identify the ECU. As you can see, this is a very short process and will only take a few seconds. The ECU has been identified successfully. We can now take a read of the ECU. However, take note, it's important not to move the probe, otherwise that will affect the read of the ECU. Select the read icon. The virtual read option is only available for OBD reading. Now we need to decide where to save the files which AUTOTUNER will generate. Choose a logical place for you and follow some standard naming conventions such as the car registration and customer name. In this example, for ease, we'll save it to the desktop. Once you've chosen your save location and file name, click Save, and this will begin the reading process. As you can hear from the chime, the read has been successful, and now the file is ready to be sent to us for tuning. You can now send this file to Viezu using the dealer portal. Your file will be returned to you within the hour after it's been tuned by one of our technical team. Now we have the file back from being tuned, we can now write it to the ECU. From here, we can choose the Write ECU option. You can either choose the tune file or the backup file. We will be selecting the tune file that was sent back to us. On selecting this file, you receive a warning, which is to check to see if you're writing the correct file to the ECU. If you were to write an incorrect file to the ECU, you could damage the ECU. So this is the time to double check everything to make sure it's the right file before you press continue. Click yes, and it now begins the upload process to the ECU. That final chime indicates a file has been written to the ECU. Following the instructions from Simon, you can now safely reseal your ECU and place it back into the vehicle for testing. Thank you for watching our video. We hope you found it informative. You can now visit our website for more information and training.